Hello, hello, hello. What do we have for you today? Got the stream up on my laptop. Put it down to the lowest quality so we can ignore it. We're listening to some What If Alt History. His latest release, less than 24 hours ago. The Anthropology of the Left. So this should be very interesting. I do find his videos very insightful. He's a bit dense in what he tries to communicate, but I think he's a pretty effective communicator. He's clearly has some form of autism. He's on the spectrum somewhere, but very, very studied, very researched, and he has a good. I like the way his brain works. It's holistic. It's narratively convincing and clear. So let's get into it.
What is left? I want to make it clear, and I think you folks already know this mostly, but I clearly have a dog in this fight. I'm known for being a conservative pundit who has said some negative things about the left in the past. First of all, finding a person without a political axe to grind today is nigh impossible. Even when centrists show up and try to openly be as centrist as physically possible, they get shoehorned in by the left and the culture in general into being part of the conservative coalition. Studies have found that the demographic breakdown of the population in America is 1/3 conservative,
This would make sense. Yeah, the people who care politically are conservatives. It's just that there's a lot of idiots who get shoved into the Democrats because they don't know any better.
1/3 leftist, and 1/3 politically inactive.
Like, half of the Democrats' voter base is just like people who literally don't know any better.
They found in said study the apoliticals weren't principled political centrists, but rather anti-intellectual normie idiots. Secondly, what matters more than the political dog racing is the truth. If something is the truth, it's just the truth. You can stop there. If someone says something true, it doesn't matter what their motivations are or how they reach their conclusion. What matters is that they won the race to the finish line. Being fair isn't 50-50. An ideal...
That's what I mean. He does this too. He puts these giant paragraphs, and it's distracting. We should respect everyone's positions, their views, and way of life, not showing bias and blah, blah, blah. Accept social conservatism and the values of most people in the West. That's evil and must be destroyed, and we hate Donald Trump, and let's kill anybody who supports Donald Trump. Yeah, okay. Love and tolerance.
Our society sometimes pretends to, but we don't commit to. Being fair is saying the truth for what it is. The fact that we're operating off any other principle, in direct opposition to the West's intellectual heritage since the ancient world, is a sign that we are a society that the left has already completely changed. We operate under a leftist philosophic worldview in a level where, at this point, even conservatives are working inside the left's logic. There's a book by Tom Holland called Dominion, and it's about how much Christianity influenced the modern
And hopefully not that Tom Holland, but
world in every conceivable way you could possibly imagine. I made a previous video on this topic if people are interested. What Holland says is that Christianity has influenced the...
This is something people don't know, is they don't know how fundamental and ingrained Christianity is into everything we know about our culture. It's baked into our language, it's baked into our culture, it's baked into architecture, it's baked into literally everything. All of our cultural stories, all of our values, all of our principles, our legal system, all of it's based on Christianity, Christian ethics. It's so pervasive that you literally can't... I don't even think you can be a true atheist.
World, so much so that even people who are purposely anti-Christian end up becoming indirectly Christian through taking Christianity's assumptions about the world without even thinking about it. The irony is that the anti-Christian left does this given the values of the meek...
Trans rights are human rights, no platform for fascists.
...being good, equality, progress, and utopia.
Oh, fuck.
One of my favorite underlying
fuck
points
you.
that
Doesn't go back to
we
where it
are
was.
all left does this given the values of the meek being good, equality, progress, and utopia all stem from Christian thinking. We forget this, but go to India, China, or the Roman Empire, and they didn't believe any of that stuff. I'm going to argue here that leftism is what Christianity was to the whole of history is to the modern world. We fundamentally exist in a leftist world today. Every single thing someone says, the way they see the world, and even how the right acts is all based on leftist philosophy. There is basically nothing in our world today that is not leftist. In the same way that Christianity permeated the Western mind
this much is
so
true
much
as well.
that you struggle
This much
to
is
find
true.
anything that's at least
Like, disillusioning yourself from leftist perspectives is actually really hard. That's why, like, Chronic is so interesting to listen to. Because he just completely, like, bitch slaps the leftist perspective. And you're like, yeah, why the fuck did I think that? Why did I have that perspective? That's not masculine. That's not sensible. That's not based.
not
true as well.
somewhat Christian. I think our world is so colored by leftist assumptions that we are all leftists. One of my
Not me.
friends likes to say, the future is whatever
I don't think women should vote. Not me. I don't believe in a materialist, egalitarian, secular society. Nope. I don't believe in secularism. Nope. No, yeah, we're not all leftists, okay? Not all of us. Some of us aren't.
left says, people can't conceptualize anything except the left's future of progress, social engineering, and equality. The right merely rejects this future, yearning for a past that never really existed, while the left are the only people with a comprehensive direction for tomorrow, even if it's an incredibly delusional view of the future. Let me use myself as an example. I am well known for being a libertarian rightist, which is the exact opposite of Marxism. However, I see Marx's influence on my ideas a lot. Marx was the first guy to look at the patterns in history to predict the future, which is what I do. Class analysis, something Marx
but everyone
invented,
does that.
is something I do all the time and is a trademark for
Yeah, and I
me
eat. Marx
vis-a-vis other
eats.
intellectuals in the
So
space.
what?
Marx talked a lot of the contradictions of the current ideological system and why there was an inevitable revolution that would
Anybody
form
can
around the ideology
criticize
that he has
the
developed.
current West.
Guess who predicts that there's going to be a revolution against the ideological contradictions of the current society while proposing a new ideology and a manifesto? Even while being his opposite in many ways, Marx still has a huge influence on me. Thomas Sowell has made a really fascinating point that's really stuck with me. He said in the modern world that what the left is clear, and whatever is not the left is the right. That the right basically shares no features across its coalition.
This is true. There's
When
no
you look at the
unanimity,
left, you see
unanimity amongst the
Marxist-derived
right.
ideologies which believe in a unified technocracy based around equality of all people, social engineering used to bring about utopia, wealth redistribution done through the state, the blank slate, among other things. That being said, when you look at the right, you find the Taliban, libertarians, Nazis, monarchists, Confucians, neocons, militarists, religious fundamentalists, and boomer cons, which are all shoved in
And
the same box.
what about
These people
technocrats?
really share nothing
What about
except
the
support for
technophilic?
some sense of tradition and opposition to the left's worldview. Mind you, in fighting against the left, they
This is
also
true, though. The right is
develop
disorganized and
similarities,
schismed.
as I said before, including some preferring to an older social order, even if the left has become the new status quo. What's been going on here is that the left has a shared proposition that they've been trying to conquer the world with for the last 200 years. Meanwhile,
200?
whoever happens to be in that
Industrial
place at
Revolution?
that time who fights them, whether in World War II Germany with the Nazis, modern Afghanistan with the Taliban, or modern America with the Republicans, are whatever the right is positionally. The last 200 years have been the global battle between the right and the left. You see it as early as the French Revolution, then 1848, the World Wars, communism, and now the culture wars today. The amount of sheer ideological difference between leftism that happened during the French Revolution and modern wokeness is not that big. I've read a couple interesting books which compare the things radicals in the French Revolution said to the modern left, and it's really interesting. Ironically, the Marquis de Sade, who, as we all know, was a real really nice guy, spoke about the depersonalization and the alienation that would come about from the sexual revolution, or human life, in a way that seems perfectly in touch with the most hedonic factions of the left today. If you want this explained better, read this text wall. The best book on this topic, although one that's admittedly difficult to read, is Fire in the Minds of Men by Billington. I'm going to reference it a lot for this video. It's a book on the 19th century origins of the modern left. He talks about how French thinkers in the 1820s like Saint-Simon talk about how we needed mass migration and liberation from the third world, which would cause a war of liberation to free the first world. He wanted to create a priesthood of the science, which would create secular religion to honor the discoveries of science. He wanted to create a new man, interchangeable from old cultural ties, and to have complete androgeneity between the sexes, pushing for something that sounds like trans. Every single thing in the modern left can be found in French thinkers 200 years ago, like Saint-Simon. In my opinion, he's one of the most underrated historical figures. Between the 30 Years' War and the French Revolution, Western civilization was stuck in a conflict between Britain or France, that being underlied by capitalism versus mercantilism. From the Black Death until the 30 Years' War, it was Protestants versus Catholics. Before then, from the collapse of the Frankish Empire until the Black Death, the largest ideological struggle inside Western civilization was between the Catholic Church and secular authorities like the Holy Roman Emperor. These kinds of divides are completely normal over history, with other examples being the Optimates versus the Populares in the fall of the Roman Republic, or the Armagnacs and Burgundians in 14th century France. In each case, these ideological battles overlay some ethnic, regional, or class interest where ideology rationalizes it. As I frequently say, people just like killing each other and make up reasons to do it. Over the course of this video, we will explain what the underlying social, ethnic, economic, and psychological drives behind the modern left are. I think a lot of you guys will find this application of anthropological techniques normally used on other cultures when applied to the modern world fun. It's actually pretty easy to put all the pieces together, but y'all have to wait a second. What I will say is that there are two lefts over history. There is the Western left and the Eastern left. This is an idea I've developed myself when I looked at the history of leftism. I think Western left is the line from Rousseau through the French Revolution, then into Bohemian culture, Weimar, the 1960s, and now with wokeness. Meanwhile, Eastern leftism starts with Karl Marx, then Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, and now with the Chinese Communist Party. The Western left is more libertine, feminine, delusional, anarchic, gay, and green. The Eastern left is masculine, authoritarian, aggressive, statist, and direct. I actually think it's useful to study them as completely different movements, since they seem to be operating off different trajectories. Yeah. I've already made a video on the Eastern bloc of leftism, that being the communism video. I've purposely tried to put different content in each video, and so there's lots of stuff I'm leaving out.
Yeah, one's like authoritarianist.
You should watch that video to know on a deeper basis.
That's true.
Thus, this video will focus on the Western branch, or basically the Western leftists that we see fighting over the culture wars today. Antifa and BIPOC, not Lenin and Deng Xiaoping. The theme which we subtly teased out earlier, that the left can determine what is socially acceptable today, should be an important tell, which we'll gradually answer later. I think this is a really fascinating topic to cover, given what the left shows as its face and what's really happening under the hood are so different. The irony, and this is a feature, not a bug, is that what the left says they are and the truth are so different as to basically be opposites. Over the course of this video, we will look at the demographics, philosophy, and psychology of the left. Part 2, Demographics. One of the tweets of mine that went the most viral, which got over 1 million views, was when I said, I don't think the Jews are to blame for the left. Rather, I blame the Jews and women, Calvinists, and the bureaucracy. I think for each of these, they share some of...
It's not the Jews, it's the Jews and women, the bureaucracy, the French, and Calvinists. Why the French? I don't understand.
the blame. As we will get into later, I'm going to throw in another group who were decisive to the formation of the left, the French. Although the French importance has shrunk over time, historically we have the illusion of knowing what the story is. The problem of writing about the present versus writing about the past is that we knew what happens afterwards. When you read enough about a particular era of history, you realize that people at the time were worried about a million different trajectories that just didn't happen. The feared Russian conquest of Europe in the mid-19th century, the French invasion of England, or a communist revolution in America, all of which serious people worried about. However, we can know what did or didn't happen in the past. For example, when I talk about historic conflicts, I can often distill it into a single variable. The parliamentarians versus the royalists in the English Civil War were bourgeoisie capitalists against the old gentry and nobility. The whites versus the red in the Russian Civil War was the Russian heartland around Moscow versus the fringes. The American Civil War was the slave-owning South versus the industrial North. There are at least four separate correlative trends that you can use to predict the demographics of the left. These are four separate trends that stack up almost perfectly onto the other, in America at least. I know things are kind of different in Europe. Those being cities versus countryside, managerial versus merchant class, low agency versus
urban versus rural. Yeah, okay. Bureaucracy versus merchants. Male versus female, that's often understated. Used to not matter, but now it fucking does. Low versus high agency.
Versus high agency, and female versus male. To explain all of these, if you look at a map of red states versus blue states, it's very clearly an urban versus rural map. The blue states are the states with the huge international cities. Places like New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, or Chicago. Chicago is a great example of this, in that in almost all cases, the rural areas of blue states, like downstate Illinois, upstate New York, or the Central Valley of California, are conservative. Meanwhile, cities in red states like Austin, Dallas, Kansas City, or Atlanta are blue. On a statistical basis, the strongest correlation by a significant margin for whether someone is conservative or progressive is that conservatives would rather live outside a town to have a larger house with more land, and leftists would rather live closer to the action and have a smaller home. This is an almost perfect urban versus rural.
Yeah, I would. So I guess that makes me right then.
Proxy. The beautiful thing about the world is that there are multiple layers of causation always happening at once. The anthropological nature of cities establishes incentives in which you naturally see something like leftism show up. An important fact to keep in mind is that only since the Industrial Revolution do we see majority urban populations. I talk about this theme more so in my video on population collapse, but cities are anthropologically different in that, for example, ever since the ancient world, cities have always been incapable of demographically sustaining themselves without countrysides. On top of this, cities have always historically been atheist or agnostic and have been places of creativity and also moral degeneracy. This is since inside cities you can't use social ties to maintain moral standards. Humans evolved to live in small communities in which everyone knew everyone else. Cities remove that, thus allowing them to be creative systems which can produce lots of cool stuff, but at the expense of social stability. Keep in mind that there were certain people who had value systems roughly similar to the modern left in the pre-industrial world, but they tended to be cosmopolitan aristocrats. People like some Italian Renaissance humanist thinkers, Tolstoy, Marquis de Sade, or some ancient Greek thinkers like Epicurus. The reason there aren't that many parallels to the
authoritarian left, authoritarian right, everyone before 1800. Libertarian right. Look, I guess the Vikings and colonials are down here. Colonial Americas are down here. Some failed messianic religious cults.
Left in pre-industrial societies, in which almost every society before the Industrial Revolution is in the authoritarian right box of the political compass, is that all pre-industrial societies were rural. You can also map this correlation in that France was the first country in Europe which urbanized, building its entire elite around Paris due to the centralized monarchy. Thus, France was the first country in Europe to to experience leftism or agnosticism, that being the French Revolution. After this, you can correlate the rise of socialism with urbanization, as you can see from this text wall. The other correlations make sense from looking at the urban-rural split. This is why the founding fathers of the left were all French. I am going to keep recommending the book Fire in the Minds of Men by Billington, but the entire first generation of leftist thinkers were all French. An interesting side note here is that modern socialism came out of various sub-factions in the French Revolution. Inside the chaotic maelstrom that was leftist French revolutionary politics, the different political factions were literally made up of people who went to different cafes. Thus, you could map different factions of radicals based on the streets that the cafes they went to were. France had a 50-year demographic lead on the rest of Europe, which is a trend that goes back to the Middle Ages. What that means is that France consistently hits overpopulation 50 years earlier than the rest of Europe. This also explains why, in the early 19th century, leftism jumped to Germany, Italy, and Poland after originating in France. Once those societies experienced population booms, this fusion is what created communism, or the eastern branch of leftism, as Marx was a Jew from the German Rhineland. If you look at a map of the modern Western left, or a subvariety which I colloquially call WEFism from the World Economic Forum, is that it almost perfectly maps onto Calvinism. Calvinism was
that's another thing people don't really talk about. They don't mention that part.
Sect of Protestantism, which believed that humans were born in sin and that most would be cast into hell, which we had no control over due to divine predestination. Calvinism was strong in the Netherlands, Scotland, Eastern England, southwestern France, the German Rhineland, Switzerland, or Berlin. After that, they populated the American Northeast, who in turn populated the Pacific Northwest, or English-speaking Canada. If you compare the areas that supports modern globalist ideologies like the World Economic Forum or wokeness to Calvinism, it's literally just the same map. Calvinism involves a theocratic, educated elite, much like the professors who dominate wokeism. Calvinism had a small, anointed caste who had to fight on in a sinful world. This was so similar to the modern left's vision of the world that Thomas Sowell titled his book on the leftist view of the world, The Vision of the Anointed. The concept of castes, of the saved and sinners, also fits very closely with the modern woke creation of a racial caste system of oppression. Calvinists are also predisposed to messianism, or an attempt to build a utopia, or, as they called it in New England, a shining city on a hill. Calvinist societies pushed for equality, standardization, and state intervention to very strict levels. It was the 17th century's equivalent to the nanny state, in which you were fined for arguing with your wife too loudly. If you're interested in this topic, check out my videos on American regional cultures. There's also a different argument that the Quakers, another British Protestant sect, founded modern leftism, which, even though I am a Pennsylvania Quaker, I partly see, but I don't think it's the underlying cause. The Quakers pushed for women's rights, full suffrage, and the abolition of slavery. However, you look at the Quaker diaspora in both England and America, where they went for libertarianism and hyper-capitalism. Quakers pushed for classical liberalism or freedom of choice, while never going through social engineering. The soft-heartedness of the left and a lot of the ideas comes from the Quakers, though, but then it disseminated to other groups who actually pushed it. Then there's the popular argument that the modern left is founded by the Jews. Again, like all of the other arguments here, there is a strong element of truth. What I will say is that none of these groups are really responsible, in that the left formed as an organic whole, incorporating discrete elements into its own thing.
I'll tell you what's probably a better thing is that, or a better narrative construction, is that all of these idea systems, all of them are antithetical of Christianity. So they all operate as demons and different families of demons that all operate against Christianity. So they have lots of overlap because they share a common enemy, which is God, Christian God. That's why they overlap. Really, what the modern progressive left is, it's a coalition of these demons into a single unity. Because there should be really no uniformity to the left, because it doesn't share an ideological grounding. There's no ideological grounding for the left that even really stays consistent within its own purview. The only consistent part of the left is that they hate straight white Christian men. And I mean, they hate straight white Christian women too. It's just they can kind of weaponize their female nature to kind of destroy from within. So that's why you have this kind of unity and kind of working togetherness and kind of this overlap. A lot of overlap between these different groups is because they all operate in antithesis to Christianity and to God.
Jews have had a vastly disproportionate element in the creation of the modern left. This is especially pronounced in certain sub-regions and eras. For example, almost all of the postmodernist thinkers were Jews. Mid-century America, the rise of communism in Russia, or the Weimar era were also very disproportionately Jewish. In my opinion, Kevin MacDonald and Kurt Doolittle are the people who have made the best arguments for the Jewish element in the left. Basically, that you can trace certain parts of leftist philosophy either towards a Jewish self-interest to protect themselves from nationalist governments, which have very frequently targeted them, or that the left is a projection of certain elements of Jewish society and philosophy. The Jews have always cared a lot about social cohesion and welfare inside their own communities. The Jews also have a bent towards messianic thinking that they are on the edge of reaching utopia, and if they are morally good, God will reward them with victory or confusing the good for the truth. Jewish culture also has a idea of criticism in which the prophets would do social criticism of the ills of society. Even though there is an element of truth, I think this argument gets pushed too far all the time. There are a couple counterpoints to also look at. The first is that the Jews are vastly disproportionate in literally everything, including the far right. Jews are only 1.5% of America's
I think it's just a trait of Jews to be like disproportionately represented in things. In general, there's something about their cultural group which helps them stand out disproportionately. Basically, I think they've been persecuted a lot, and then that's forced them to evolve different strategies on how they survive. And then whatever this superpower they've developed, it's basically allowed them to have disproportionate representation in these groups. I don't think it means that all Jews are powerful. I don't think it means that all Jews are smart. It's just whatever their cultural makeup is, it makes them really good at standing out. It makes them really good at getting into these positions of power and authority and then influencing it. And I do think that they also have a cohesive structure for power because they care about themselves. They have high in-group loyalty, right? So they just have these combination of traits which just make them good for getting into certain groups and infiltrating them.
Population and less of Europe's. I am of British and Irish ancestry, and I have lots of hyper-left-wing relatives. It seems strange to think the Jews just brainwashed most white Western women. Wouldn't it make more sense if the Jews happened to supply ideas that fed into white women's self-interests? The problem is that if you factor the Jews into being the left, the equation just doesn't add up. You have too many ecosystems that had
prevalence of communism in Asian countries with no Jews. Yeah, so, yeah, it doesn't fit one-to-one, but it's definitely a large contributing force. Yeah, I don't think it's all, but they all operate as, like, different demonic forces that occasionally work together and have occasional overlap when they're trying to kill white Christian men. Basically
no Jews, and yet still had the left. Look at China, the Spanish Civil War, Stalin purging the Jews from the Soviet Union, or why is Israel...
Yeah, you don't think demons tear each other's arms off once in a while? You don't think two demons? You don't think a succubus and a demonic bull go head to head every once in a while?
Conservative politically. The irony is that the Jews in politics tend to be moderate leftists, in that the people like Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, Saad Gad, Konstantin Kizin, Brett Weinstein, among others, tend to be the moderates. The raving insane people on the left are either our BIPOC brothers or white Anglos or other Europeans. If you removed all Jews from the West today, the left would just get crazier, given the Jews are a moderating force on the left. You would still have over 100 million white radical leftists. Ironically, this is proven by the
This is true. This is also why I don't think, that's the biggest reason why I don't think that the Jews own progressivism, is because we have Free Palestine, which is the most ironic thing ever. That's total infighting amongst the legions of Satan. They can't even agree on what they want to do. The golem's attacking its citizens. This is quite ironic. So yeah, that's another big reason, because you would not be seeing this
on the Jews recently with Palestine. This leaves the two final demographics which make up the left, which we will analyze in the next two sections independently, those being women and the bureaucracy. Part 3, the philosophy of power. The entirety of leftist philosophy is built on its most fundamental level by the idea of the blank slate, the noble savage, and the open view of humanity. These three ideas are actually the same thing, or that human nature is good by its natural form, and that social conditioning makes us bad. The lesson here that we...
Is that an accurate way to describe the left's belief system? Is that humans are by default good, and it's only by social external conditioning that we're bad? The noble savage, human nature or tribal groups in the wild are naturally good. Human culture makes people bad. Human nature is good and then gets corrupted. We just need to reach that goodness. No, this is retarded. The blank slate, human nature doesn't exist in that. All people are born as blank slates that can be downloaded with whatever information others want them to. Social programming determines everything. Retarded. The open view. Human nature is inherently perfectible. If we get social engineering right, we can build a utopia. It's contrasted with the closed vision that thinks human nature is flawed and needs social structures to hold us accountable. My problem is the construing of human nature as either being perfect or flawed. It has to be perfect or flawed according to a metric. You could argue it's flawed, but we have to define what that metric is we're saying for perfect or flawed. Human nature just is. Like, that's the first thing we have to start with. Human nature is. It does what it does. It functions the way it functions. We then impose a value system upon it. It's not innate to its ontology to be perfectible or flawed. That is a concept that is imposed onto what we observe about our own nature and to our own perceptions about our own nature. Our nature just is. So let me point out what's wrong with all of these. The noble savage, human nature or tribal groups in the wild are naturally good. No. You don't think tribal groups killed each other all the time? You don't think tribal groups ever committed murder, committed sin, stole from one another? You think they just acted perfectly good all the time? That's ridiculous. And what would that be based off? In the wild, they're naturally good. Human culture makes them bad. Okay, based off what? Human nature is good and then gets corrupted. There's an element of corruption. Corruption as a concept exists, but if you took a bunch of humans who've never seen or known of anything wrong, and then they would still generate sin. If you took humans who were perfectly oblivious to sin, they would still generate sin. Because you can see that babies evolve it naturally. You can see that children evolve behaviors that were never taught. Now, a lot of it is taught. Plenty of times people get corrupted, and plenty of times evil behavior is learned, but sometimes it's just evolved naturally. Same way most ideas are learned, but I can also just come up with an idea naturally. There's a basic biological procedure in your brain that says that governs your behavior. That says, so sometimes you're like, well, if I steal it, then I can get it for myself. That's just been programmed into your biology to consider the possibility of stealing or consider the possibility of murder. Like when you get angry and you kill someone out of rage, did you do that because you were socially conditioned to feel angry? You're socially conditioned to feel rage, and then you were socially conditioned to commit violent murder? Look at the Bible. I know they don't believe in the Bible, but bear with me. The first murder, Cain and Abel, where did Cain learn to kill? Right? Where did he learn it? Where was he socially conditioned to do that? And also, there's a fundamental problem, which is that if everything is just socially conditioned into us, then where is the first sin learned? Where do we learn sin? Who invented the first sin? And if one person can invent it, then why can't we all invent it? Also, what about human culture makes people bad? What is it about the culture that makes them bad? What does that mean? What does that statement mean? Where does the badness lie within culture? And how is culture distinct from humans as a group, such that badness arises from culture, but not just humans? There's a lot that doesn't make sense. So yeah, there's much wrong with this. The noble savage. What a retarded ideology. So yeah, please explain how culture makes people bad. People are just always good and then get corrupted. Human nature doesn't exist, and that all people are just blank slates that can download whatever information others want them to. Yeah, within limitations. One, it has to be functional. It means it has to work. You can't just teach them to walk on their hands all day. That doesn't work. You couldn't create a culture where people just walk on their hands all day. And it has to work. So it has to be effective for navigating the world, or else they'll collapse. It has to be understandable. So you can only download things onto people which they can actually grasp and comprehend. And then it has to mesh into some kind of system that seems internally consistent. So it has to abide to some degree by the rules of logic. Obviously, you can have logical imperfections in a system, or you can have parts that are not completely flushed out, but it needs to have some kind of logical structure, else it won't mean anything to the individual you're trying to download it on. It's also not what we see in nature. Do you think a cat needs to be socially programmed to know what it is to be a cat? No. So if we evolved from animals, then why would that be any different? Why would humans need to be told what to do to be human? We don't. We very much, for the most part, don't. The only thing that's really phenomenal in that regard is language, which is that we slowly evolved language, which is quite impressive and quite significant. But that would also be heavily due to the way our brains are constructed for language. Brains have a large partition in them specifically for language. The brain is engineered in many ways for language. The open view. Human nature is inherently perfectible. If we get social engineering right, we can build a utopia. Not really, because human nature is evolved from the world around us. So it's based on the fact that the real world exists, and there's certain limitations and there's certain facts about the real world that we have to adapt to. So like the reason, so let's talk about like why does antisocial behavior or sin, why does sin or antisocial behavior exist at all? Why as a species is everyone just not perfectly harmonious and loving and caring and peaceful all the time? Wouldn't it not be evolutionarily beneficial to just never kill and never steal and never create social chaos? Well, the reason is because there's actually advantages to being selfish. There's advantages to engaging in some of these sins that are baked into your biology, and your biology gets them from the fact that, well, sometimes it's worth it to steal because there's limited resources and you need to survive, and sometimes stealing is the only way to eat, to pass on your genes. Sometimes sleeping with your neighbor's wife is the only way to pass on your genes, right? Sometimes you need to engage in acts of violence, perhaps even kill, to defend what you care about. So human behavior is measured in this way, in that there's pretty much any decision can be good if it's in the right context. There's a context for every kind of decision that we make. It's not always evil. And it's based off the real world around us. So unless we can reinvent the entire world around us to be cohesive to a human nature, which is then socially engineered to be a certain way. But I think it's more fundamental than that. I think it ties into the very nature of reality. I think human nature is linked intrinsically to the nature of reality itself, the laws of physics and everything else around it. And that, like, in essence, human nature it's a reflection of what is. The world is the way it is. The laws of the universe are the way that they are. And from that necessarily stems humans and their nature and the way that it operates. It doesn't stem from culture. It doesn't stem from socialization. It doesn't stem from social programming. It doesn't stem from genetic engineering and utopias. It stems from the way that it is. And the way that it is stems from science and what we know about the world and its history and the basic roots of our world.